This podcast is brought to you by Dragon Shield. Use code PLAYTOWIN5 at the affiliate link down below for 5% off to help support the show.
Welcome to the Play to Win podcast, where we talk about winning in cEDH. I'm Cam.
And I'm Dylan. This week we are talking about all of the colorless spells, the best ones that we have access to in cEDH.
That's right, but before we do, make sure you check out our Patreon at the link below to help support us directly and get some awesome extra perks.
There's a lot of good, powerful colorless spells in cEDH. A couple of them near the top go in every single deck. A couple of them are combo pieces that don't go in a lot of decks, but we're going to talk about all the ones that we think are good enough for most or a good chunk of cEDH. Where are we starting today?
So we're going to start with Mana Crypt.
Yeah, there's not going to be a ton to say about these first four. They just go in just about every deck, but Mana Crypt especially. 0 mana is incredible. To go from 0 to mana, turning your Mana Crypt into Arcane Signants and Fer Stones and things like that is super powerful.
Because we all know that it's free, but it taps for 2 mana, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you flip a coin, and if you lose the flip, Mana Crypt deals 3 damage to you.
Right, yeah, this is a 5 out of 5, easily one of the best, if not the best cards in cEDH in all of Commander.
It's always the first card that I put into the deck that I'm building, no matter what. It's always going to be Mana Crypt because 100% of the time, that's the card that allows you to have the most busted starts in the format.
Yeah, absolutely. And the life loss is basically nothing. We start with 40 life in this format, so losing 3 every other turn on odds is just like not that bad. And even at its worst, if you lose 9 mana 3 turns in a row, you've still had 2 extra mana for 3 turns in a row, so you're in like a really good spot and it's worth it.
Yeah, so Mana Crypt's the easiest 5 I think we've ever given out. The next card is Soul Ring. This is Mana Crypt, but without the drawback because it costs 1 generic mana to cast.
Staple of the format.
Another one,
the best card in every Commander deck, normally 5 out of 5. It's just the 1 mana is a little bit different. Obviously, 0, you can turn 1 Rhystic Study a little bit easier off of Mana Crypt than you can with the Soul Ring, but still Soul Ring is insanely powerful.
We have to rank these cards together, though. So which one is better, Mana Crypt or Soul Ring?
Mana Crypt's better.
Unless you have Urza Saga, then Soul Ring is better.
I mean, technically, yes, Mana Crypt isn't strictly better, but I think it's a lot better still.
Yeah, I go Mana Crypt, then Soul Ring, and now Chrome Mox is the next card that we have to talk about. This is another free mana rock. It has imprint, so when it enters the battlefield, you may exile a non-artifact, non-land card from your hand, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of any of the exiled card's colors.
Chrome Mox being 0 mana and tapping for mana right away makes it one of the strongest cards in the format, specifically because you don't need to imprint a card. If you just need a free artifact, that can sometimes be Chrome Mox. Very, very strong for people to do that. Allows you to have busted starts, allows you to explode out of nowhere. The extra cards is easy to get in a format where we have Rhystic Study and our commanders and things like that will be able to have extra cards more reliably. The card just goes in every single deck. It's just an extra mana. You need that speed boost in cEDH.
Yeah, the card disadvantage doesn't really matter. It's very important that it gives you color pips as well. This is the first mana rock we've talked about that does that. So being able to fix you is also very important. The non-artifact clause is also something to watch out for. So you can't put Wishclaw Talisman or Phyrexian Metamorph under this card. Most other things are going to be fair game.
Yeah, yep, exactly.
This is another 5. Is it better or worse than Soul Ring and Mana Crypt, though?
It's worse than Soul Ring and Mana Crypt, but it's just under them, I think. The boost in mana, I think, 2 is just being more than 1 is more powerful than colored mana versus colorless mana.
Especially not having to give up another card in your hand, too. That is a cost.
It is a cost, and Soul Ring being able to help you to pay for staxing effects like Rhystic Study and things like that a little bit easier than the Chrome Mox can, that's also helpful.
That's a great point, too. Yeah, getting around like S% Null, helping you get through like even Thalia's, too. Not that that's common anymore, but that's still something to keep in mind. MOX Diamond is the last card of the final 4 that we put in like every single cEDH deck. This is another free mana rock that when it enters the battlefield, you may discard a land card. It says instead. That's what threw me off.
It's worded strangely because it's not a trigger, so it has to enter. There's no moment where MOX Diamond is in play before you discard the land.
So it actually says if. It's an if MOX Diamond would enter the battlefield, you may discard a land card instead. If you do, put MOX Diamond onto the battlefield, and if you don't, put it into its owner's graveyard, and then you can tap it for any color.
If it wasn't worded so stupidly like that, you could put it into play, and then with the trigger on the stack to discard a land, you could tap it for mana right away, and it would act like the Lotus Pedal.
That makes sense.
Would be even more powerful.
It's kind of like the clause on clones, where it's as it's entering, it just doesn't say as. It says if, which is kind of funny. If it enters the battlefield.
Yeah, it is kind of strange wording. But either way, MOX Diamond is incredibly powerful. Normally, we have at least 25 to 30 lands in cEDH decks, so this is normally turned on. And being able to play a 2-mana spell on turn 1 is super powerful. Same thing with CHROMOX. The card disadvantage doesn't quite matter because the boost that you get in speed overcomes that by a lot.
Exactly, yeah. So this even makes like land heavy hands look a little bit better if you have something good to do with the mana. It's just CHROMOX, but you pitch lands instead.
I think it's better than CHROMOX. I think I would more often rather pitch a land than a spell, because getting rid of a spell can kind of be bad sometimes.
Especially, too, because the thing that you discard also helps you fuel Underworld Breach, too. So it's just like this extra little bit of synergy in those decks.
Yeah, discard is better than exile. So yeah, so far it goes Mana Crypt, Soul Ring, MOX Diamond, CHROMOX.
So our next card then is Mana Vault. This is a 1-mana artifact that doesn't untap during your untap step, but at the beginning of your upkeep, you may pay 4, and if you do, you can untap Mana Vault. At the beginning of your draw step, this is the third phase that's mentioned on this card now. At the beginning of your draw step, if Mana Vault is tapped, it deals 1 damage to you, and you can tap it to add 3 colorless.
Yeah, this one's a little bit closer to a ritual than it is like a typical mana rock, because you only get that mana advantage once, but 1 mana to make 3 mana is huge. Dark Ritual rate, which is some of the best just generic mana production that we have. If you would play Dark Ritual, you should probably play this. If you're playing Ad Nauseam, you should probably play this. If you're playing a commander that has 3 generic in its mana cost, you should probably play this, but you're not always playing Mana Vault. There are some decks that don't play it.
Yeah, if you're trying to run MOX Opal, you should play Mana Vault, I think.
Probably.
And I really like all those other scenarios that you brought up already, too. That's pretty much it with Mana Vault. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say, keys.
Voltaic Key and the other one.
Manifold Key.
Manifold Key.
Those cards are seeing a little bit more play in like the low color artifact decks that want to untap the One Ring a ton. So if you are playing any of the keys, this is just like another really cool thing to do to help you really explode on mana.
Seedborn Muse is another example like that. And there's the artifact that untaps artifacts. Clock.
Unwinding Clock.
Unwinding Clock.
Yeah.
Those are other good ones for Mana Vault.
So I think Mana Vault is going to be a really high 4-point something.
Realistically, like a 4.5, but we make silly decimal points in this show a lot. I feel like it's closer to like a 4.82.
Honestly, I was thinking it's going to be closer to a 4.8 as well, like the really high 4-point somethings.
Yeah.
Because it's very rare that I'm not including this in decks anymore.
Yeah, definitely. And even the decks that I don't include it, there are certainly times where Mana Vault still would be great, and it like could go in there.
Exactly. Yeah. Like even if I'm playing low CMC commanders, but still Dark Ritual, I want this, like you said. The more large commanders like Tivit and Atraxa that we want to see, like I'm going to want this card in a lot of those decks.
100% agree. Yeah. Well, should we go 4.89 maybe? Almost a 4.9? Or is this a full-fledged 4.9?
It's not a 4.9. It's a 4.89.
4.89 sounds right, too.
You're ridiculous for thinking it's a 4.9.
4.9? What am I, a buffoon?
MOX Opal is the next card now. This is a legendary artifact that is 0 mana and has Metalcraft. So if you control 3 or more artifacts, you can tap it to add any color of mana.
It itself is an artifact, so you only need to have 2 other artifacts, which is pretty relevant sometimes. MOX Opal is one of the questionable MOXs, I think. CHROMOX and MOX Diamond are so easy to turn on because you have to have the thing in your hand. Where MOX Opal, that's not the case. The amount of artifacts that you have to have for MOX Opal to be good kind of ranges from deck to deck, to be honest.
Kind of has to be at least 15.
I think it has to be at least 15, but it also depends on situations. Like there are decks that with a little bit lower artifact count that can play MOX Opal because they're drawing cards in huge bursts. So by the time that they're ready to play the Opal, they have other stuff as well. But still, 15 I think is a safe number. Realistically, closer to like 18 is like better for MOX Opal. But there's other things like Lotho and Dockside that I think can count towards your artifact count because they can feed that too.
I won't count those if I need 15 artifacts, but if I need 18 artifacts, then I'll start counting Ragavans and stuff that will make treasures because it's not super reliable. I might need those treasures for mana at weird times. You just have to watch out how you're timing it with MOX Opal, but I really like what you were saying, like a post ad nauseum. This is like the exact kind of mana rock that you want to see after you find like at least 1 or 2 more of them in your ad nauseum pile. This is exactly what you need to help get you over the hump to win the game then.
Yeah, and MOX Opal is another good one to note as something that's an easy loopable thing with things like Displacer Kitten or with things like Teferi or with things like Tidespout Tyrant where you need to like loop artifacts, bouncing them in and out, bounce back and forth. MOX Opal doesn't have an ETB. You have to remove something like a CHROMOX or a MOX Diamond. Some of those loops, they won't be able to repeat with those. Whereas MOX Opal, as long as you have Metalcraft on, you can bounce it back and forth with double Tidespout Tyrants or things like that.
Yeah, its downside instead of the card disadvantage is the Metalcraft, but also being legendary, which doesn't really come up in our format, which is pretty nice. Unless like you are in Kinnan and you want to copy it with Phyrexian Metamorph for some reason.
It's pretty much only a downside. I don't know if there's any like real upside for being a legendary as a 0 mana artifact in our format, but I could be wrong. Either way, Mox Opal's great. A little bit lower than Mana Vault, I think.
have it as a 4.
A 4? Oh, I wouldn't know. I don't know it was that low, but maybe. I kind of have it pretty similar to Mana Vault, to be honest, but I guess there are certainly decks that Mana Vault sees play where Mox Opal doesn't. I have it a little bit higher than a 4.
I guess that's true. If I'm playing Mox Opal, like I said when we were talking about Mana Vault, I probably want Mana Vault. Like I'm playing the other mana rocks to make sure that Mox Opal's turned on. You know what? That makes me want to say Mox Opal should be that much lower because it needs all these other cards for you to be able to play it.
Yeah, that's true. My only hesitation on that is I think some of the best decks in our format play Mox Opal. I think
that's
Kinnan
true.
and Roxai, and I'm pretty sure even Blue Farm plays Mox Opal.
Honestly, you should be looking for excuses to play this card.
Exactly.
With like the One Ring
exactly.
and stuff.
Where I'm not as much looking for excuses to play Mana Vault. There's just other things that do similar things. That 0 mana investment, no other card disadvantage, and it immediately makes a color of any choice. That can be really important.
This should be a 4.5.
I think it should be a 4.5.
This should be a 4.5.
Yeah, let's go 4.5.
Worst card we've talked about so far, Mox Opal.
Yeah.
Our next one is MOX Amber.
Okay.
This is another legendary 0 mana artifact. It taps to add 1 mana of any color among legendary creatures and planeswalkers you control.
This one doesn't see as much play.
No, but I think it's seeing more play. For the first time ever in cEDH history, now that the format's at this slow metagame, I'm seeing this card seen play in 3 CMC commander decks now.
Yeah, having that boost of free mana when you want, like when you just to reward you for doing what you already do, which is play your commander, that it is really good.
It doesn't help you get your commander out, but that's okay because in Thrasios or like other 2 mana commander decks, this is Arcane Signant.
Right, and I think as Arcane Signant, it's great.
These 3 mana decks, like these Stella Lee decks are playing it, and I don't know. I think that's a little questionable. Not only does Stella Lee have to untap and shit, but like you also have a mana rock that doesn't help you too much. I don't know.
It does make a little bit sense if you want to jam your Stella Lee on turn 2 with some other production and you use the Mox Amber to help you hold up protection for the Stella Lee, but I agree with you. Not being able to cast the Stella Lee with it is a big downside.
If Stella Lee's on the stack, you can't tap it. Like you need Ragavan in play already or something like that. So it's really hard to use as interaction until it's already in play.
I was saying like use it to protect your commander once
After it's in play. I'm
Yeah.
thinking about the stack before it's in play. So I see where you're going.
I'm not sure it'll get counterspelled quite as much as it'll get target removal. Do you know what I mean?
In general, yeah. Yeah, your low CMC commanders are going to get on board removed before they get countered.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you wouldn't play this in a Traxel or an Atali,
No,
a commander that wants to get countered.
I have thought about it. There's like a ton of times where I felt like maybe I should play Mox Amber so that once I get Atraxa out, I can like help protect it better.
That's
but
funny.
The most important thing is just getting the Atraxa out. I'm already playing Force of Will and other ways that can naturally help protect the Atraxa, so yeah, it's not as good there. But it's still a very powerful card. I think this one's closer to a 4.
It's probably a little high to be giving it a 4 just for how infrequently it is still seen play, but free mana is hard to snub at, so I will take a 4.
Yeah, definitely. In Roxai, in Kinnan, it's definitely an all-star card, so yeah, it's still very strong.
Lotus Pedal is another free mana artifact that you can tap and sack it to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. It's 1/3 of a Black Lotus.
Is a treasure token on a card is what this card is.
So many things now.
I have often thought of this card about as strong as Mana Vault. I view them kind of in the same way. Sometimes I think Lotus Pedal is a little bit stronger. I kind of think of it as like the 5th main rock where it probably should just go about in like just about every deck. But it is somewhere around Mox Opal, Mana Vault, somewhere in that range, but I think it might be closer to Mana Vault than it is Mox Opal.
I think so too. The ability to help you power things out much earlier is so powerful that it doesn't matter that this thing isn't going to stick around. This is your backup LED in case something happens to it if you're trying to loop with Underworld Breach too. So it plays a really good role in most decks. I would put this at a 4.9. I could be swayed to put it as a 5 and just put it under Chrome Mox, but there are a couple decks, the slower green decks that want to play Collector Oof don't necessarily want this, but even then, like, this helps you play turn 1 Collector Oof. How do you not want this?
It's a little bit tricky, but
Maybe
I think I
this is
agree
a
with
5.
you. I think it's better than Mana Vault, but I think it is a level worse than Mox Diamond and Chrome Mox, for sure.
So is this, I'm going to put 4.95 for this because the sliver of how much worse it is than Chrome Mox is so small, and there is a surprisingly, I think, larger amount of decks that want this card versus a Mana Vault.
Yeah, that's probably true.
The commanders that don't have the heavy colorless mana side of them would much prefer to have something like this. So even like your 2 mana commanders that don't want another card we're going to talk about soon would rather have this because it can still cast their commander really early.
What card?
Jeweled Lotus.
Oh, okay.
That's the next one we're going to talk about. Jeweled Lotus is another free artifact that you can tap and sack it to add 3 mana of one color to your mana pool, and you can spend this mana only to cast your commander.
Yeah, Jewel Lotus is super strong in the decks that it's powerful in. It doesn't see play in quite every deck, and it's kind of strange. Like, I'm going to keep on revisiting some of the most powerful decks in the format, but Roxai and Kinnan oftentimes don't really play Jewel Lotus, whereas in any of the bigger commander decks like Tivit, like Traxa, even something like Najeela or Blue Farm, where you're looking to pay that full 3 mana for your commander, this card is unmatched. It's so strong.
Yeah, if your commander is 3 or more mana and you want to see it in play, you should be playing this.
Even if this only counts for like 2 of your pips, like if you're in something like Kess is like the first thing I can think of where you can just use the Jewel Lotus to cast for 2 of it, I still think that's good enough. I still think that's playable in your deck. When it starts to get not good is when this is just going to be a Lotus Pedal for your commander. At that point, I think it gets a little bit worse.
But Jewel Lotus, though, is still going to be seen play in a majority of decks. Any of these 4 mana commanders, like this is the perfect home for something like that because it just really helps you get your commander out on turn 1, which is exactly what you want to do. Helps you play cards like Fierce Guardianship and Deflecting Swat a lot easier in like your 5 mana commander list too. So really like what this card does for commander decks.
Absolutely. I completely agree. How to rate is a little bit tricky. I think it's probably, I mean, it depends on the deck. In some decks, it's a 17 out of 5. In other decks, it's not playable.
Yeah.
So I think overall, it's probably close to MOX Opal. I think somewhere in that 4.5 range.
In that 4.5 range. I'm a little surprised we're going to go that low. I think it's going to be a little bit better than MOX Opal. I think more decks are going to want it. Do you mind if we put it at a 4.6?
4.6 works for me.
Just so that way, I think it's better enough to be distinguished a little bit higher.
A little bit better than MOX Opal. It's tricky because it probably does see play in more decks than MOX Opal does, but MOX Opal probably sees play in better decks than Jewel Lotus does. It's hard to rate that like completely accurately.
Yeah, that's hard to say. But that sounds true. I just don't know enough about it to dispute it.
Kinnan and Roxai are the main ones that don't play it, and they're probably
huge.
They're
parts
probably
of the
the 2 of the best decks in the format, which is just kind of interesting. But maybe they're outliers more than they are. Maybe like that's just they're powerful on their own.
How it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Good question. All right. Arcane Signant is 2 mana for an artifact that taps to add 1 mana of any color of your commander's color identity.
This is the best 2 mana rock we've ever seen. By
and
far.
I don't know how we could ever beat it.
Yeah. For 2 mana rocks, yeah, it would have to make 2 mana. It would have to make more than 1 mana for sure. Arcane Signant is super powerful. He's playing a ton of decks, but definitely not some of the more lower to the ground decks sometimes. Sometimes that 2 mana is just you don't want to spend 2 mana on a mana rock. That's just too much. You want to spend only 1 mana or less.
But most 2+ color decks are going to want this effect. Just in general.
I'm not playing it in Blood Pod just because there's other things that make mana. I have way more access to like other things that make mana.
No, the Mana Dork decks is where I start to want this a little bit less.
Yeah.
Like, especially a Tymna Mana Dork deck where you on turn 2 are trying to jam Tymna. Like, I like this a lot better if you are consistently seeing cards like Mana Vault and Soul Ring and Mana Crypt in your opening hand to help you power this out on turn 1.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely agree. It makes all of the Chrome Mox and Mox Diamond hands a lot better because if you can play land, Mox Diamond, Arcane Signant, and then hold up removal spell or play an Imperial Seal or something like that with that Arcane Signant, that can lead to a very broken start. And the fact that it can help pay for any color of Counterspell or Tutor or whatever you got is super important.
MOX Amber's a 4, and it's definitely better than MOX Amber.
It's better than MOX Amber, but it's not quite as good as MOX Opal.
I don't think it's as good as MOX Opal either.
I think probably like a 4.5.
I think 4.5 just under MOX Opal's fine.
Yeah, I think that sounds right.
The next cards that we're going to talk about is actually a series of 10 cards that are the rest of the Signets.
Okay.
This is Talisman. No, they're not. They're Talismans. They're not Signets.
We're talking about Talismans or Signets?
We're talking about Talismans. We're not talking about Signets. Signets see significantly not very much play.
If you ask me, Arcane Signant should have been called Arcane Talisman.
It should, because that's
it doesn't
really
filter
what it is.
mana, which is what Signants do.
No, it
Signants
taps
filter mana.
4 mana
it
instead.
Taps 4 mana, and it should have lost you a life also to match with the other talismans.
Realistically, yes, because each of these talismans tap for 2 different colors of mana.
Either or,
but also tap for a colorless mana. If you use them to make color mana, though, it does deal you a damage.
In certain decks, these cards are necessary. In certain Grixis piles, I love them in Atraxa. They're really good. In Kinnan, they make the double mana, so that's really powerful. A lot of decks will play 1 or 2. You just don't want to bog your deck down with too many of this card. That's the main issue.
Kenrith, right now, my 5-color Kenrith deck, I play Arcane Signant, and 2 of these talismans.
Yeah.
And then the next card that we're going to talk about too, which is Fer Stone. We'll talk about that in a second.
Yeah, oftentimes these cards are going to be worse than Fer Stone too. It depends on the deck. Like in my Turbo Grixis deck, I'm not playing Fer Stone. I'm playing the talismans that I have that make blue mana specifically over the Fer Stone because it has to be able to make the mana that I need it to make. But sometimes I question that. 90% of the time, Fer Stone is an Arcane Signant. It just taps for everything because someone played, we're getting to Fer Stone. I'm sorry. We should talk about this card first.
No, I'm going to read Fer Stone right now, and it's all a part of one. Fer Stone is another 2-mana artifact that taps to add 1 mana of any color that a land an opponent produces can make.
There's oftentimes a command tower or a city of brass or some type of 5 color, or between 3 opponents, there's all just types of lands. But there are those rare situations where in your Grixis deck and you're playing against a green-white deck and a deck that hasn't played any lands yet, and you know what I mean? And it just doesn't tap for anything useful.
Or you're on the play and you try to do that really cool thing with Mana Vault, like I said, where you use it to tap for another Signet like this, and then you forget that no one else has a land. You can't actually use this on if you're on the play.
Overall, I think Fer Stone's better than the talismans.
I agree.
But they're close, and I won't play more than like maybe 2 talismans. 3 would be a lot, I feel like.
At most in my decks, I'm maxing at 4 2-mana artifacts that tap for 1 mana.
Yeah, I think so. And Arcane Signant and Fer Stone are normally the other ones.
They're the first 2 I put in before I put in blue-based talismans if I'm in blue, or just whatever else my main color is going to be.
To be honest, I think I'm going to change my Grixis list to have that Fer Stone in over one of the other ones, because I think I have the Rakdos Talisman, Talisman of Rakdos, and I think I'd rather have Fer Stone than that. Although
I think in your
red is good.
But your ad nauseum deck, I also want to keep in mind that like Fer Stone is not going to cost me life to tap. Even if it's not going to tap for red or black, like even if it's making colorless mana, having that extra flexibility where it's not making me lose anywhere from 2 to 4 or even 5 life per game potentially. I like having that extra flexibility.
Yeah, I think so. I think Fer Stone is probably like at a 4.4 because I remember Arcane Signant's at a 4.5.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, so then the talismans are probably like a 4.2.
Enough better than MOX Amber that I'm playing them in significantly more decks, but I think that there is enough more of a downside to talismans on an everyday level as opposed to that one little scenario with Fer Stone when you're on the play and can use it.
And I also want to mention that I think the Talisman of Blue-Black, Talisman of Blue-White, and Talisman of Red-Black are like the only ones that actually see play.
Talisman of Blue-Red I will play sometimes too.
Okay, sure. Talisman of Blue-Red and then Talisman of Blue-Green because of Kinnan. But then outside of that, the other ones don't see as much play. Talisman of Red-Green doesn't see play really.
Unless you're in,
I guess a Tali might.
And even then, that's the worst one. I've seen lists that cut that Talisman even too.
Yeah, there's asterisks on all of these. But there's specifically the Blue-Black one, the Blue-White one. The blue ones are the best ones.
The blue ones. If you're playing a Orzhov deck, you're going to play Talisman of Hierarchy, but like you're not going to love it.
Right. Yep.
I guess you will because you really need options in that color.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I really like our list so far. Our next card is Lion's Eye Diamond. This is another Cheerio mana artifact that you can sacrifice and discard your hand to add 3 mana of any one color to your mana pool and activates this ability at any time you can in an instant.
Another one that's worded a little strange. Important things to note about Lion's Eye Diamond. One, you don't have to tap it to sacrifice it, which means if there's a Manglehorn in play, you can still go through your breach line. That's totally fine. That's pretty important. Number 2, you have to discard your hand before you cast a spell. This is an obvious one, but sometimes I see people make a mistake.
Oh, I'm going to cast Force of Will with this mana. No,
right,
you're not.
No, you're not. Everything in your hand has to go into the graveyard in order for you to make this mana. But there's a lot of like weird situation you have to work with. This is a combo with Underworld Breach, which is the strongest thing in our format, and it works really well with Ad Nauseam because if you put the Ad Nauseam on the stack first and discard the other cards that are bullshit in your hand with the Lion's Eye Diamond, if the Ad Nauseam resolves, you will have the 3 mana that you make with the Lion's Eye Diamond, which can be very helpful to start your Storm turn.
Same thing goes with Wheels too. Same thing goes with like Tutors as well. There are scenarios you can get yourself into where this is just Black Lotus for you and can really take you away.
If you're casting the last card in your hand, that's like a Demonic Tutor or a Wheel of Fortune, you can use that Lion's Eye Diamond mana in a good way in that situation. You just can't use the Lion's Eye Diamond mana to cast the spell that you're casting.
That's already in your hand, yeah. But this really shines with Underworld Breach and is really the only reason why we're playing it in decks.
I think that if the only deck that would still play Lion's Eye Diamond, and I'm sure there are other decks that would, if their Underworld Breach wouldn't exist, is like the turbo fast Ad Nauseam decks. I still think they would probably play Lion's Eye Diamond,
that's true.
But specifically like just the black-red ones. Once you get access to blue and you can have the ability to protect your Ad Nauseam a little bit, Lion's Eye Diamond I think gets much worse. Maybe it's still playable. Who knows with that pretend format would look like. But Underworld Breach is the main driving factor with that.
I mean, even without Underworld Breach, Yawgmoth's Will is still a card, and that's the same thing. You pitch everything, and you still have access to everything in your graveyard. It's just a little bit different.
I think if Yawgmoth Will is active and you discard your hand, those things will get exiled.
Sorry, I mean, you hold priority with Yawgmoth's Will in the stack, same way you would with the Tutor.
Okay, all right, yes, yeah.
And then everything
obviously.
that you discard is seen by the Will.
Okay, yep.
What do you give LED? Is this the worst card that we've talked about so far, or is it good enough as part of the Underworld Breach 3-card package that we still want to give this a 5?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think it's quite a 5 because there's a lot of decks that don't play it, and you have to be playing a specific combo, but arguably, like, you have to be playing the best thing to be doing in our format, which is Underworld Breach, Brain Freeze, Lion's Eye Diamond.
That's a good spot to be.
Right. So it's hard to rate it super accurately, but because it doesn't go in a lot of other decks, I want to rate it like a 4, realistically. Whereas, like, it doesn't go in everything, but the decks that it goes in, it's a powerful combo piece.
I totally agree, actually. I'm going to put it above MOX Amber, but because it's a 4, it's not going to be as good as these Talismans, which you can use and be flexible throughout the entirety of a cEDH game. Sometimes Lion's Eye Diamond, you run out really early because you don't want it to get hit by like a Rhystic Study or something like that, and then it does nothing for you the entire game.
Yeah,
There's
that's true.
games that it will just be a dead card.
I wonder, I mean, we gave Thassa's Oracle a 5, and Thassa's Oracle doesn't see play in every deck, and is completely dead outside of the combo. Whereas Lion's Eye Diamond does have some applications outside of its combo, but is mostly dead.
Nobody complains about Lion's Eye Diamond the way that they complain about Thassa's Oracle, and I think that has something to do with it a little bit too. The call for Thoracle to be banned because of how good it is, I think is something. No one says that about Lion's Eye Diamond.
Yeah, that's true. I still would give it a little bit higher than a 4, I think, now that I'm kind of thinking about it, because it is still so powerful in the decks that can use it powerfully.
What are you thinking?
Closer to Jewel Lotus, like a 4.6?
If we average it, then that gives LED a 4.3.
I definitely think it's better than the Talismans.
All right, well, then it's worse than Fer Stone, then.
Fine.
It's just such a funny spot that we have it in, but that's where it's going. All right, let's talk about Defense Grid.
Oh, yeah.
Seeing a little bit more popularity, I think, right now. This is 2 mana for an artifact that says during each player's turn, each other player's spells cost 3 more to cast. This is your silence for decks that don't play white.
Basically, that's exactly what this is. If you want silence, you're not playing white, you play this card. It's important to remember that this card, 1, can never be interaction. Like, silence can sometimes be interaction against your opponents. And 2, you have to win the game. You can't just jam this and pass.
No, you can't.
Theoretically, if you're the only turbo deck at a table full of control decks, you can jam this turn 1 and untap turn 2 and win, but that's a risky move, and I would not recommend it unless you are very confident in your turn 2 win. This card can be super good. It basically is going to shut opponents out entirely. Most often, they're not going to be able to hold up 3 full mana on a turn. They're banking on using a lot of free interaction and 1 mana spells, and even if they can pay for the 1, they're probably not going to be able to pay for multiple, so if you have ways to protect your thing even further, that can be also super helpful. It's really good in decks that can sacrifice artifacts as well. If you can get rid of that artifact whenever you need to, that
this
could be
was
good.
Like one of the best cards in Armix Crown, because I could just discard it to Armix because it was so bad in that deck all the time.
Yeah, exactly. If you have a way to get rid of it, that can be super helpful.
Yeah.
As far as power level, I think it's a little bit less than a 4 because it doesn't see play in a ton of decks, but it's good in the decks that play it.
Yeah, honestly, it's very like specific quick decks that aren't playing white, which is kind of limiting. That's Rogside, that's a Tali. Like, even though it is seeing more play, I still think that Defense Grid's going to be a 3 because it does bite you in the ass if you don't play it right.
I think I agree. I think it's about a 3.
Great, there we go. The One Ring is our next card. The One Ring is a 4-mana artifact that is indestructible. It is legendary, and when it enters the battlefield, if you've cast it, you gain protection from everything until your next turn. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose a life for each bird encounter on the One Ring, and you can tap it to put a bird encounter on the One Ring, and then draw a card for each bird encounter on the One Ring.
This card has quickly skyrocketed to one of the most powerful cards in our format, I think.
Every deck can play it. Every deck should play it, and this card is going to win you so many games because of the amount of cards you're seeing. The protection's hysterically relevant in a lot of scenarios too. This is an easy 5.
Yeah, I think it's a 5, which is crazy to say that a new artifact printed in this year has shot up to a 5 out of 5, but it really is so good. I agree with everything you said. It goes in play in every single deck. It makes the bad decks even better. It makes the good decks better than they should be, probably.
It's made a lot of decks that stopped seeing play after Paradox Engine got banned see play again. Now, like, Arkham Dagshaker Skeleton has a reason to exist in the format now more. Derevi, Imperial Tactician, has a reason to exist in the format a little bit more.
Yeah, Derevi's a great one because it can untap that ring a whole bunch of times, especially with things like Voltaic, which doesn't see a ton of play, but things like Manamo, which does see a bit more play now because of the One Ring specifically.
If you're in blue, you should just play Manamo too.
It gets out of control so quickly.
It does, and it really snowballs. This is a 5. This is up there with now the 5th artifact that I don't exclude from any decks anymore. Is this better than Chrome Mox, Mox Diamond, Soul Ring, or Mana Crypt, or is it just that much more important to be able to cast the One Ring than to even have it in your hand?
I think, yeah, the mana is more important still. 4 mana is a little bit. There are going to be times where you're not going to quite be able to cast this, or it's a little bit too late, or maybe it kills you before you get to win with it because maybe your deck stinks or something. I don't know. So, but I still think it's the 5th rock.
You talking about Curie?
I think it's still the 5th. There are some decks where if you say I have to exclude it because of XY reason, I'll say, okay, I guess that's fine.
I'll roll my eyes a little bit, but I'll understand at least.
It's still a 5 out of 5 for sure.
Yeah, definitely. All right, 5th best card we've talked about then. Should we talk about Grim Monolith? Grim Monolith is a 2-mana artifact that doesn't untap during your untap step. It taps to add 3 colorless mana, and you can untap it for 4 colorless mana.
I used to value this closer to Mana Vault than I do now. Now I value it closer to the Talismans than I do now.
I do too. And this is a card that, again, I will only play in very specific scenarios. If my commander has 3 generic pips in it, I will play it. If I am running my normal 4 signets, I will consider this too. Because what's really nice is on turn 1 or 2, use this to cast a signet and then use that signet to cast another signet. I think that's just a ton of upside right there.
For all the same reasons we said Mana Vault was good, things like Seedborn Muse and Untappers and stuff like that, Grim Monolith is in a similar boat.
Although maybe even a little bit better because Nyx Bloom Ancient makes this go infinite. Power Artifact makes this go infinite. Any way that you can make that colorless mana requirement to untap it cost less than it will tap for, you can go infinite with. There's just less scenarios that you'll see that now that, like, no one's playing Zerda in Thrasios Brews anymore. Power Artifact is just not something you see because Urza has better ways to make infinite mana now. So it's really kind of fallen off in a lot of those scenarios too over the years.
I still think it's strong. It's not a 4.9 like Mana Vault because 1 is just so much less than 2, but I still think it's probably like a 4.2 or 4.3, somewhere in that range.
Yeah, I'm going to give it a 4.1, I think, because I think there are enough decks that are excluding it now that it's not quite as ubiquitous as it used to be, and I'd rather have Talismans in my deck before I put Grim Monolith in.
That's fair.
All right, cool. Let's do that then.
We're only talking about colorless artifacts, right? Even though the Talismans have a color identity. Like, should we talk about...
I changed it to colorless spells. What other colorless spells should we be talking about?
Like, we're not talking about Birthing Pod, because I think we talked about that in green. Did we talk about green?
We didn't talk about Birthing Pod.
We didn't talk about Birthing Pod?
No.
My favorite card?
Birthing Pod would get it too. It would get it too
You
anyway, because there's like one deck that plays it.
Yeah, but it's a good deck.
Yeah, but it's
one of my favorite decks.
still one deck that plays it.
Okay, fine.
All right.
Wandering Archaic is a colorless spell that I would talk about.
That's true. That's a 5-mana avatar. That's a 4/4 that says whenever an opponent casts an instant or sorcery spell, they may pay 2. If they don't, you may copy that spell and choose new targets for that copy. I'm not reading Explore the Vastlands because I don't even want you to think that there is a backside to this card.
There's not. It sucks. Don't do that. This card, though, is a both ways top-end stacks piece that I've been enjoying a little bit recently. In Blood Pot, I have played things like Inferno Titan, and in the past, now I'm playing this instead. It's a little bit easier to cast. 5 is less than 6, obviously. But also the fact that this can stop my opponents from winning the game sometimes, because if my buddy has a counter spell, we can help stop the person who's trying to win the game. But it can also help protect my own combo, because if someone tries to counterspell my combo, I get to copy it if they don't have that 2 extra mana. So it can go both ways.
Yeah.
I really like that aspect of it, is it can stop my opponents from winning the game sometimes, or at least help stop them. It can help me win the game sometimes. And it can also just give me generic value. If someone has a removal spell, I say, let's team up. I can get rid of something else that I need gone too. So I like the fact that this can do a lot of different things. It doesn't come up always. Sometimes people can play around it, but that 2 mana, when people do play into it, you're going to get a lot of value if they can't pay that.
Okay. What changed your mind on this card? Because previously on this podcast, we've not liked this card. So what changed you?
Like seeing that it can also protect your own stuff, seeing how it interacts with counter spells. The more I played against this card, like, it's a lot more powerful. And also, as the format slows down a little bit, as the format gets a little bit slower, as Kinnan starts to excel a little bit more because the heuristic studies take over, everyone's already taxed on so many other things. It makes it a little bit more difficult to pay for this one as well. I think just over time playing with the card, and as the format got a little slower, maybe kind of like it a little bit more.
I can see that. I could also argue that the slower the format gets, the worse this gets, because this just gives people more time to play around it then,
yeah,
too.
That's true. But as the time, you benefit from that time, because if they are playing into it, you're getting double the spell. So you get to keep up on card advantage a little bit better.
That's true. I guess that's true. So, like, you kind of already have to be set up, and then you have to get to 5 mana.
Well, you don't have to really be set up. You can just get to 5 mana. You don't have to have anything for this.
I still don't like it, is
Okay,
where I'm going at with it.
Yeah.
I'm going to give it a 2. I think there are decks, these non-blue decks like Blood Pod, I think that's where it's going to shine a little bit more. Or like a deck like Kitten that just has like really easy ways to cheat out mana. But even then, I think it's one of the weakest creatures you can put into play in Kinnan. I think the average cEDH deck doesn't want this. It's too much mana. It doesn't do enough. That's just what I think, though.
Just doesn't do enough.
That's just me personally.
Okay,
yeah.
That's fair enough. Yeah.
What are you going to give it? Because I'm going to average our 2 together.
I still probably give it only like a 3. In the decks that it's good in, I think it is really powerful. In the decks that don't have access to heuristic study, this can be another version of heuristic study and can get you advantage when people play things for the similar reason. And in decks that can make a ton of mana, I think the 5 mana is a little bit less relevant, but it doesn't see play in every deck for sure. It have to be in a specific situation.
You're not pissed at me because I gave it a 2, right?
No, I don't care.
No? Okay. All right.
I
don't know. I got really self-conscious for a second. I was like, oh no. All right. Eternal Scourge is our next card. This is 3 mana for a creature Eldrazi Horror 3/3. You can cast it from exile, and when it becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you exile it. So this card is a food chain combo piece.
I've actually been playing this over Mist-Hallowed Griffin and not playing Mist-Hallowed Griffin at all in my food chain lists. Yes, Mist-Hallowed being a blue spell is relevant with things like Force of Will and Force of Negation, but the difference in mana between 3 and 4 and being able to combo off with just a little bit less difficulty with the Eternal Scourge just makes it that much better, and I don't think you need 2 of the effect.
I totally agree. I think that the only other thing, like you said, Force of Will, like Chrome Mox is another thing that you can do that's really clever with Mist-Hallowed Griffin, but Scourge is better enough that I wouldn't even want Mist-Hallowed Griffin. I'm not playing it in a Tali because I think Squeeze a little bit better just in case it goes to my graveyard.
Yeah, Squeeze is better.
But there's times now, man, where like Talion's on 2, and I'm like, I could win the game if I did play Eternal Scourge. I don't think that comes up enough for me to want to include it in a Tali, but like it's come up enough that I've thought about it.
So Eternal Scourge is still probably 2.5, 2.
I'm giving it a 2.
It only sees play in food chain decks, and food chain decks aren't always great.
That's why I'm only giving it a 2.
Yeah, but in those food chain decks, it's necessary. It's a combo piece, so it's good.
So Springleaf Drum is our next card. This is 1 mana for an artifact that you can tap and tap an untapped creature you control to add 1 mana of any color.
1 mana to tap and make 1 mana is a rate that we do not have in Magic. We have Soul Ring that makes more than that, but 1 mana to tap for mana of any color, that doesn't exist. So Springleaf Drum is super powerful. Even having to tap that creature, yes, that's something, but oftentimes that creature is not going to attack anyway, or it's a Rograk, so it was free, or it's a Kinnan, so you're going to double your mana out of the Springleaf Drum. So Drum, I think, is a very underrated card and is super, super playable.
Sees play in Thrasios decks, because you're never attacking with Thrasios. Sees play in Magda, because it makes 2 mana with Magda in play, which is awesome. So, like, this card is seeing a surprisingly large amount of play for what I think it should be, actually, but it works well.
The main thing that it's not going to see playing is something like Tymna or Najeela. I guess Winota would probably play too, but like decks that are trying to attack with their creatures and are purposely trying to deal combat damage to their creatures, a lot of times won't play the Springleaf Drum.
Even Tivits, they're just too creature light a lot of the time too. So what do you give this card?
I give this one close to MOX Amber, but it's not quite a MOX Amber. I would say 3.5.
I was going to say 3.2, but I don't feel like giving it a 3.3 repeating, so we're just going to give it a 3.5.
3.5 it is.
That sounds good. Okay. Paradise Mantle's the next card.
Very similar.
It's the opposite of Springleaf Drum, right?
Yeah. Oh, kind of. Yeah.
This is a 0 mana artifact that is an equipment, and it equips on a creature, and that equipped creature says add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool if you tap it, and equips for 1.
So with Rograk, this is just, it turns your Rograk into a mana dork, basically. You have to wait a turn with the creature, which can come up and makes it a little bit worse than Springleaf Drum, but it being 0 versus 1 mana is relevant with Ad Nauseam. The 1 mana to equip is a little bit, you still have to pay that 1 mana, but it's a little bit weaker than than the other, but it's still strong.
It's still strong. It gives them a chance to interact with that equipped thing too. So like it's something you need to make sure that you're doing right away as opposed to being able to like leave it up later, I guess, like Springleaf Drum can.
I think probably only Rograk plays it right now and like Arden decks. Other than that, you have to have like a really specific reason, like 0 mana creatures in play that you're going to want to play this with. So it doesn't seem playing a ton of decks. It's probably closer to like a 2.5 or something, to be honest. But
I actually think this is the worst card that we've talked about so far, because at least Eternal Scourge, there's multiple food chain decks that it will see play in. And like Paradise Mantle, I think its windows of play are a little bit smaller.
It's just Rograk and Arden, and probably just Rograk.
Yeah, exactly. So let's give it a 2 and put
2
it way
is.
at the bottom.
Yep.
Yeah. Cloudstone Curio is 3 mana for an artifact that says whenever a non-artifact enters the battlefield, non-artifact permanent enters the battlefield under your control, you may return another permanent you control that shares a permanent type with it to its owner's hand.
Yeah, this is a combo with Dockside Extortion. This is the main reason why we're using this. So if you have Dockside and another creature and the difference in their mana values is less than the amount of artifacts that the Dockside is going to be making, you can bounce those 2 creatures back and forth, and each time Dockside will make more and more treasure and allow you to go infinite.
Honestly, it's an infinite combo with the Sticker Goblin as well.
Sure, if it makes enough, if the sticker makes enough.
If you can make 5 mana with the Sticker Goblin, or I guess 4 if you have like a free creature that you can keep repeating, then you can go infinite with Sticker Goblin though too. I've never played Sticker Goblin. I don't know how reliable it is that Sticker Goblin is actually a seeding song.
To be honest, I've sleeved it up twice in Godo, and I didn't draw it either of those times.
Okay.
So I have no idea either.
Because I see it in a Tally list. It's not in my Tally list because I just don't want to deal with stickers. Like, I just don't want to. And if it's not going to guarantee me a specific amount of mana, the only reason why I would want to play Sticker Goblin is so that it can go infinite with Cloudstone Curio if I can't go infinite with Dockside. But if it's not going to guarantee me to do that, I don't know if I want it.
That's fair enough. Yeah, I think it has to make a minimum of 4. I'm not positive on that, so don't maybe double check me. But I think it has to at least net mana all the time. But I understand like not wanting like you want your mana to be consistent. That definitely makes sense. But we're not talking about Sticker Goblin. We're talking about Cloudstone Curio, which is a powerful card, but only if you are not playing white, only if you're not playing blue, and only if you are not playing. I mean, sometimes if you're playing green, because if you can play Emil the Blessed or Baron Master Wizard, you probably want to play those instead.
You should do that instead.
Because those are 2-card combos with Dockside, whereas this still requires you to have a third creature, a third card, which is not difficult, but can be a problem in certain decks. In certain decks like Rograk, it's a lot easier because you have your commander that's free all the time, but in other decks, it can be a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think this card's probably a 3. Unless you're comboing with it, you're not really going to be doing a ton with it, but it is a very unique piece that even in the decks that do want it, like there's other cards that you might be playing that have good ETB triggers you might want to be able to reutilize too. So I don't know. I think it's a 3.
That's fair. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, 3 it is. That's good.
It's worse than Defense Grid though, right?
Yeah, 2.9.
Oh, yeah, 2.9. That's way more accurate, yeah. Speaking of Defense Grid, here's another card that I don't know if I like or not. This is Conqueror's Flil.
Yeah.
This is 2 mana for an equipment that says equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each color among permanents you control. Who cares? As long as Conqueror's Flil is attached to a creature, your opponents can't cast spells during your turn, but it has an equip cost of 2.
This one is an expensive silence for decks that can't play silence.
Do you need a silence that bad is my question.
I think so, specifically in Rograk decks. I also play in Crown Francisco. Grixis just really wants that ability to be complete protected super bad. Your combo being Lion's Eye Diamond is very fragile, so being able to protect it is nice. And when you can make boatloads of extra mana, the 4 can be kind of nothing if you're playing Jessica's Will or things like that. You can just like have that extra mana. Now, I would never touch this card if you're playing white, and I'm only really touching it if you're on like kind of very aggressive ad nauseum all-in fragile combos, and you have access to realistically Rograk, but sometimes just a 2-mana creature can also be fine. So if you have access to like a Thrasios in your command zone, although you're playing blue, so don't play this if you're playing Thrasios, but like a 2-mana commander, I still think you can justify playing this one. But outside of that, I don't think it's good, but inside of that, very powerful.
I've seen this in a Tally list even too, where you're just like trying to make sure that a Tally can't be countered. I never find myself in a spot where I have like the 4 mana to do this. I find it even tough in these non-blue decks to jam my defense grid when I need to jam my defense grid. Me personally, all of my brain in theory says that I don't want this card, but there's a lot of people doing really good things with it, and I just think I haven't given it the time of day to give it a fairly accurate rating. So
that's fair.
When I say this is a 2, take it with a grain of salt. But I legitimately think this is worse enough than Defense Grid that, like, there's enough decks that don't need it.
I think it's about as good as Defense Grid, maybe a 0.1 below. So maybe just under Cloudstone Curio, so like a 2.8.
If we average our two numbers together, we get a 2.4.
Sure, we'll take it. But I think it is very much closer to Defense Grid than you're giving credit for. I think it's still very close to Defense Grid.
I think that's probably right. And again, I just haven't given it the time of day, and I haven't actually tested it because it reads bad to me. It just reads bad. Too much mana.
Yeah.
Grafdigger's Cage is 1 mana for a artifact that says creature cards in graveyards and libraries can't enter the battlefield, and players can't cast spells from graveyards or libraries.
This is one of the few stacks pieces I feel like we're actually going to talk about. There's a ton of other stacks pieces that we could spend a whole bunch of time talking about, but since a lot of them are not really that great anymore, we're not going to talk about them.
Yeah.
Grafdigger's Cage is one of the few that I think shuts off most of the main powerful win strategies. Underworld Breach, Kinnan Lines, shuts off all green creature tutors, shuts off a lot of combos. It shuts off a lot of shit, and for only 1 mana, that's pretty huge. You can find it off Urza Saga and things like that. The issue is not that many decks can afford to play it because they're utilizing this aspect to win the game.
Yeah, it's the non-red, blue-black based decks that can really utilize this. Your Tivits and your other like Esper-based commanders, I guess, is really where it is. I loved it when I was on my big Dimir control kick. I loved it in those kind of decks too. It just does actually pull a bunch of weight in the meta.
Yeah, even something like Talion, I could definitely see Talion playing something like this.
Yeah.
Yuriko plays it. Blue-black decks and Esper decks are going to be interested in this effect.
That being said, I think this is probably like a 3.5 and better than Springleaf Drum, I would say.
Interesting. I rate it a little bit lower than that. I think it's probably closer to like a 2.5 just because I don't want to play Grafdigger's Cage. I want to do the stuff that Grafdigger's Cage stops because that's the strong stuff.
I guess that's fair. It gets a 3 then.
Yeah, 3's fine.
Grinding Station is our next card. This is 2 mana for an artifact that says tap and sacrifice an artifact to have target player put the top 3 cards of his or her library into their graveyard. And whenever an artifact comes into play, you may untap Grinding Station, which, by the way, it sees itself.
Right, yeah. So if you play the Grinding Station, it is an artifact that entered the battlefield, so you can sacrifice another artifact that's already in play to mill 3 cards, and then it would untap it right away. That's one of the little tricks you can do with this card. Overall, not a strong card. It's really good if you're playing Underworld Breach and you're not playing blue. If you don't have access to Brain Freeze, this is fine. If you do, I do not think you want to play this card. Getting rid of the top card of someone's library because they top deck tutor, that's not going to really come up very often.
You're only doing that because you're already playing Underworld Breach in your non-blue deck. That's the only reason why that comes up.
Right, yeah. Overall, I don't think this card is strong. It's closer to like a 2, 2.5, but with Underworld Breach and without Brain Freeze, it is powerful. You can effectively mill your entire deck. The issue is you don't accumulate an enormous graveyard. You can kind of just scope through your deck. So normally what ends up happening is if you have 6 or 9 cards in your graveyard, you can, with one artifact, if you have a free artifact or a Soul Ring or a Mox Opal or something like that, you can keep on recasting and sacrificing it, but you don't actually make any headway. You just sift through your whole deck. And then at the very end, once you hit Dockside Extortionist, you can then cast Dockside, use some of those treasures to sacrifice the rest. It just makes the combo a lot more complicated, a lot more convoluted, but it does allow you to win the game with Underworld Breach.
That's the thing, yeah, because a lot of those decks now you're trying to win with like dual caster mage combos, so you have to find both of those pieces and then still leave like 6 or 7 cards in your graveyard so that you can cast both of them. So definitely want to make sure you have a good graveyard setup before you do any of this.
Yeah.
I think it's a 2. I think it's probably one of the worst cards that we talked about. I'm putting it under Eternal Scourge because there are less Underworld Breach decks that want this than there are Food Chain decks that want Eternal Scourge, in my opinion.
I think I agree.
All right, we got one more card to talk about, and that is an interesting one. It's Karn the Great Creator. This is 4 mana for a 5 loyalty planeswalker that has a static ability that says activated abilities of artifacts your opponents control can't be activated. It's +1. Says that until your next turn, up to 1 target non-creature artifact becomes an artifact creature with power and toughness equal to its mana value, and it's -2 you can't do in Commander because there's no outside of the game. I guess you could find an artifact card that is exiled or choose a face-up artifact card you own in exile is the next line after you can reveal one from outside of the game, yeah.
So if something gets exiled, you can take it?
So I guess this is a little bit relevant.
Okay, so there are some situations where maybe you can get an exile thing back, but really what we're doing with this card is the Collector Oof that's one-sided. That's the main thing that we're looking for with this. And then you can kill like a Lion's Eye Diamond or a 0-mana artifact that your opponents control if they ever do get rid of the Karn. That'll be relevant.
So I don't love this Karn, just in general, because it is pretty expensive for this. And if you really want this effect, like you probably are already playing Dismantler, Manglehorn, Collector Oof, or something else like that too. However, like in mono red decks that want to play a little bit more stacksy, I do kind of like this a little bit more. Like in Magda, it's actually really relevant.
Yeah, I have been thinking about it a little bit more, especially because of that one-sidedness, but 4 mana is too much to invest in something like this, and then people are just going to be able to attack and kill it.
Yeah, it's not going to live long.
It's not going to live long. It's not going to be easy to protect. Overall, I don't love this one. It is technically another stacks piece that we're talking about, but I still think I give it somewhere around a 2, maybe even less, 1.5.
Well, let's give it a 1.7 because I was thinking a 2, but I think actually your thing makes a little bit more sense.
There's a world where maybe I'm wrong and maybe it should go in Blood Pod as another way to help interact, but the other abilities, I don't think they're enough. I don't think they're enough. If it did anything, if it made constructs or something, that would be great. I would say absolutely. Yeah. But if it doesn't really do enough of value on besides that one-sided collector roof.
Yeah, because it's -2 is doing literally nothing. Like it's going to be really difficult to get more than just a stacks effect out of this. Cool. Well, that's it. Do you want to hear the full list?
I would love to.
So starting from the bottom, we got Karn the Great Creator at a 1.7, Paradise Mantle at a 2, Grinding Station at a 2, Eternal Scourge at a 2, Conqueror's Flail at a 2.4, Wandering Archaic at a 2.5, Cloudstone Curio at a 2.9, Grafdigger's Cage at a 3, Defense Grid at a 3, Springleaf Drum is a 3.5, MOX Amber is a 4, Grim Monolith is a 4.1, Talismans all came in at a 4.2, Lion's Eye Diamond came in at 4.3, Fer Stone came in at 4.4, Arcane Signant got a 4.5, MOX Opal also got a 4.5, Jeweled Lotus beat that with a 4.6, Manivault beat that with a 4.89, Lotus Pedal got a 4.95, and then the One Ring got a 5, along with Chrome Mox getting a 5, MOX Diamond got a 5, Soul Ring got a 5, and of course, Mana Crypt got a 5.
Looks like a perfect list to me. Another perfect list by Play to Win.
Wow, who'da thunk?
Who'da thunk? Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to support us directly, you can do so on Patreon, like our $100 patrons.
Caleb Ritchie, Zach Hartley, Justin Heck, Kajo Alex, Sean in the Ice, Mark Cirillo, SoCal Acura, Stormageddon, Luke Cook, Demon of Rosgrees, Uncle Butts, Nick Foles, Goat09, Kawaja A. Hamid, Lauren Connell, and Baby G-Bus.
If you want to pick up any of our merch, you can do that at playtowinmtg.com.
Huge shout out to Dragon Shield for supporting the show. Use our affiliate link and code PlayToWin5 for 5% off your order.
Follow us on TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram for more content.
Thank you so much for watching.
See you next time.
Huge shout out to Jacob Bowler, Luca Bressold, Big Mike, Nicholas Balder, Reactive, Tyler Watson, Brian Barrington, Zachary Colson, Tyler H, X Tyler the Tree X, Mallcraft, Driving Crooner, Jabaha, Mace the Ace, Dalton Poteet, Hobo Ghost, Justin, Man Solo, Pedro, Jacob Depp, Michael Ballou, Jan Wildfang, Thomas Bueno, and David Nelson.
Tip of the tongue, the taste, the tips.
And we're going to start with the heavy hitters because 50% of people won't watch the last half of the podcast.
There we go.